Good evening and welcome to Coffee and Politics, Voting with Purpose in 2020, Part 2. My name is Allison Kelzer and I am the Student Initiative Coordinator and Digital Media and Communications Associate at American Public Square at Jewell. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who made this program possible, including all of the staff and student interns at American Public Square at Jewell. I'm so pleased that we have another opportunity this evening to showcase the recent work done on behalf of American Public Square at Jewell's Student Initiative. This initiative enables us to bring our mission of improving the tone of public discourse to college and high school classrooms in the metro with two objectives: to help educate students about why civil discourse is critical to a thriving democracy, and to equip young people in our community with the tools and resources they need to develop and lead impactful programming on issues that matter to them. At APS, we have a growing number of ways to incorporate students into our programming. We aim for our student initiative to be a real-world, hands-on learning experience. In fact, this program series came to us as an idea of APS intern and William Jewell College student, Jack Still, who is serving as tonight's moderator. If you or someone you know is looking for a digital or in-person internship for the fall or spring semester, please reach out to me at allison@americanpublicsquare.org. I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the funders of the APS 2020 Student Initiative, including the Sherman Family Foundation, the McDonald Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I would also like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program: William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and PlexPod. We would also like to give our special thanks to Cardinal Union and the Hilltop Monitor, two student-led groups co-sponsoring this event. Cardinal Union is a student organization on William Jewell's campus that aims to facilitate productive civil and political discourse among members of the student body through debates, educational events, and other interactions with the campus community. Alex Thiessen, a William Jewell College student and founding member of Cardinal Union, will serve as tonight's fact checker. The Hilltop Monitor is the official online student newspaper for William Jewell College. Christina Kirk, the chief editor of the Hilltop, and also a William Jewell student, will serve as tonight's roving reporter. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions and fact check requests from the audience. Our roving reporter, Christina, and our fact checker, Alex, will both be watching closely in the Q&A section for any questions or fact checks that you have for tonight's panelists. Please type those questions or fact checks into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you are watching the event through Facebook, you may also ask your questions and request any fact checks by commenting on the live stream post. With that, I will now turn it over to Jack Still, our moderator for the evening. Jack is a rising senior studying economics and political science at William Jewell. He is also an intern with both American Public Square and Casey Common Good this summer.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you again to all those who have tuned in to tonight's program. I feel honored for the second week in a row to be able to moderate another panel with two of our distinguished guests this evening. Tonight, we will be speaking with Representative Stephen Johnson and Stephanie Clayton. Stephen Johnson is a Republican member of the Kansas House of Representatives representing the 108th District. The 108th District is outside of Salina, Kansas, and includes the city of Lindsborg and parts of the Ellsworth, McPherson, Rice, and Saline counties. Elected in 2010, one of the primary issues that motivated him to run was the funding challenge faced by the state pension system. Stephen led the pension reform efforts of 2012 and tax reform efforts of 2017 and has chaired committees on those topics. He has also served on the House Appropriations Committee. Representative Johnson was born and raised on a farm in central Kansas, and he continues to farm to this day. He studied agricultural economics at Kansas State University and received his MBA from the University of Chicago in finance and business policy in 1993. And after 24 years working with the financial services firm Ameriprise, Representative Johnson retired as senior region vice president in 2013. Representative Johnson has put his investment expertise to work for several nonprofit entities. Last year, Stephen worked with a bipartisan group to promote civil discourse within the legislature and across Kansas. And he currently serves on the Civic Engagement Board with the Kansas Leadership Center. Thank you, Representative Johnson. Stephanie Clayton is the Democratic member of the Kansas House of Representatives representing the 19th District. The 19th District in Kansas includes parts of Leawood, Overland Park, and Prairie Village. She was elected to the Kansas House in 2012 and is the ranking minority member of the Education Committee. She also serves on the Taxation and Federal and State Affairs Committees. She is the Vice President of the National Council of State Legislators Women's Legislative Network, is the State Director for Women in Government and the Women Legislators Lobby, and she was the founding chair of the Kansas Future Caucus, a caucus for young legislators. A consultant and content writer, Clayton works on the Johnson County Commission on Aging, is president-elect of her local Rotary Club, and is an active volunteer in the public schools her 2 children attend. Thank you, Representative Clayton. And at a time when voting and democracy feel like such an important aspect of our lives, the perspectives of our elected officials should shape our conversations around policy and the future of our country, our state, and our local communities. This is especially true when it comes to issues that impact young and new voters, a demographic that may be encountering many important topics and discussions around policy for the first time during 2020's election cycle. That is why, through the Student Initiative event, we have brought together either current or former elected officials and politicians from both sides of the aisle to speak on these very issues, providing diverse and relevant viewpoints that will create an informative discussion for all those who wish to vote with purpose in 2020. Last week, we spoke with politicians in Missouri, listening to their differing perspectives on everything from healthcare policy to the state of civil rights and policing in our country. Tonight, we have with us 2 politicians from across the state line in Kansas who will have a similar dialogue, providing their viewpoints on issues that most impact America's youngest generation of voters. With that, I want to begin tonight's conversation. Representative Johnson, Representative Clayton, thank you for taking the time to be a part of our panel. I want to kick off tonight by picking up where the discussion with Myron and West left off last week with respects to civil rights and policing. Across America, here in Kansas City and throughout both Kansas and Missouri, protests have brought these particular issues to the forefront of public debate. There have been calls for reform from all over the political spectrum, while some elected officials have seemingly doubled down on their previous positions. Some have even argued that the debate has descended into a culture war, making the necessary policy changes seem out of reach. I'm going to throw this question to Representative Clayton first. What does every new voter need to know about police reform?
Well, I think what every new voter needs to know about police reform first, Jack, is that this has actually been going on for a long time, especially in a lot of state legislatures. The Kansas legislature in particular has been working on a lot of juvenile justice reform, and we have primarily been working on transparency initiatives regarding law enforcement issues. And so knowing that and knowing that that's something that's been going on for a long time, I think one of the things that voters should be asking us is, specifically what it is that we're trying to do. I'd also like to cast some clarity. I think there's a lot of confusion around the terminology defund the police. I think that not very many of us would support actually defunding law enforcement, but I think that most of us support rethinking it and looking especially at providing more training for law enforcement officers and demilitarizing the law enforcement. Not everyone needs a tank, for instance. And so I think, starting to rethink the way that we do law enforcement is really what a lot of us want to do. And I think we'll be able to see a lot of us coming together on this, especially in the next legislative session.
Thank you, Representative Clayton. Representative Johnson, what about you? What does every new voter need to know about police reform?
Well, I don't know if there is one universal set to know, but I think on all of these issues, we have to be actively asking the questions and seeking the answers and trying to do that together. I think whatever forms we have to build community, and for example, this is a great one, is how we best move forward. So out in central Kansas, the issues are different than what my colleague, Representative Clayton, may face in a more urban area. And how does that work? How is it different? Where do we have some of the same issues? And where might someone like me be unaware of issues that are faced? As we look to things to do, I checked with one of the folks on the committee that Representative Clayton referenced to say, okay, what are some of the options that we have? And there are things that can be done. There are coroner's inquests that can be enacted where a jury is impaneled to look at that. For example, do you make that a mandatory or automatic, perhaps not mandatory, but an automatic step where lethal force is used. That might get us more answers as we look to that and continue that discussion to make it deeper. Another idea is, do you have an office of the investigator general, which is in some way separated? And how do we just perhaps differently address how you might police the police? And I think there are useful pieces to that. At the same time, to the points that Representative Clayton made, I want to continue to support law enforcement. There are so many that are good that are there. There's so many truly dedicated public servants who give their lives in service. There were some great statements at the end of our session by one of the officers who is a representative and another member of our legislature, so Representative Smith and Ballard, that talked through the issue and the fact that no one condoned the actions of the officer in Minneapolis, and drilling deeper to figure out how do we make communities hold together to have the lawfulness that we wish to enjoy together, where there are equal treatment and equal opportunity under the law, is the direction I think we all agree on how to go. Training is also key. I think at Johnson County Community College, there is a training center, and there, one of the things they have is a simulation of shoot, don't shoot, and a lot of effort to see what it's like. I participated in a very light one at Fort Riley at one point in time. And when you're in that 3D world, whether it's virtual or actual, especially for someone like me that has no training, there is a lot going on to try and handle. And how do we better understand that environment? And how do we make sure that we have a way, when someone is abusing that power, that we handle that directly and swiftly?
Okay, thank you. Excellent. And I want to transition to another issue that's of equal importance and that has also dominated headlines recently, and made for a really impactful discussion topic during our event last week, and that's COVID-19. Cases of COVID-19 are continuing to rise in communities everywhere. The pandemic seems to have an even greater hold on the country than it did a few months ago when stay-at-home orders were first introduced. And the health crisis presented by COVID-19 is apparent, but the economic fallout is likely to be equally devastating. And I want to throw this to Representative Clayton first. In your view, what do our local and state governments need to do in conjunction with the federal government to set us back on a path to recovery?
Well, I think most importantly, our local and state governments need to work together with the federal government. It is my hope that we will have some sort of economic relief coming from the federal government. I mean, we're already getting some help through the CARES Act. That's been particularly helpful to us. And we've seen the state putting those CARES Act funds, I believe, into good and responsible measures. But I think importantly, I would like to see the local and state government working together a little bit more to flatten the curve, because this is one of those problems. And I think Representative Johnson, we both kind of feel this, because I represent an urban area, or a suburban area rather, where, Johnson County, Kansas's cases are, starting to flatten a little bit. We've put a mask mandate in place. And of course, we're going to have higher cases in the more urban and suburban areas by virtue of the fact that we're closer together. And, you have more people who brought it here in the first place because we do a lot more business travel, that sort of thing. But as we move forward, one of the things to keep in mind is that we want to keep cases down all throughout the state, because as cases start to rise in more rural areas, they don't necessarily have like the hospital infrastructure that a lot of us have in the more urban and suburban areas. And so it's most of the time we don't really think about how the state is sort of, I hesitate to use the term collective, but I'm going to go there. As far as that's concerned, but we really do have limited resources as far as the state is concerned. And so I'd like to see us all sort of working together in that regard, but also, the economic implications on a lot of people have been very severe, in particular with a lot of the business shutdowns that have been necessary. And so that's part of the reason why I support preventative measures, because if everyone masks, you can still have your businesses open. You can still bring in revenue. You can still, have people having health insurance. I know we'll be talking about that more later on. But so to me, I look at, let's do the least painful thing, the easiest thing, so that we can prevent another shutdown, so that hopefully, especially here in Johnson County, we can open up our schools again, having those safety measures in place, because if we don't do those preventative measures, then we are going to end up back under lockdown, which is going to be devastating. So I know Representative Johnson will probably talk more about some budget implications too, and I'm happy to take follow-ups, but I don't want to talk the whole time, so I'll turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Clayton. And yes, Representative Johnson, I want to hear your perspective on this. In your view, what do our local and state governments need to do to work together in conjunction with the federal government, set us back on a path to recovery from COVID-19?
So thanks, Jack. And again, agreeing with Representative Clayton on most of those issues, it really does come down to how do we manage each of the areas as best possible. Given that the state legislature isn't meeting currently, it leaves it to the governor, the executive staff, the finance council, which is a group of the legislative leaders, to make decisions to figure out how to best allocate those CARES dollars. I actually don't know exactly how many have been allocated and how much remains from the current amount that was allocated to Kansas, but that's one of the roles of the state government, is to do that. I think it really is up to the counties, and even more than the counties, to each of us just to ask the question, how do I keep everybody safe? And there's two pieces to that. One is absolutely direct with the virus, and I agree with Representative Clayton. If I can wear a mask in some environments and keep something open, I want to do that. Even if I think it has a benefit, I'm interested in considering that. When I'm on the farm, and I really am, often a quarter-mile distant from the nearest person who's probably in another vehicle or house at the time, the world hasn't changed a great deal. That feels pretty similar. Wallace County, who hasn't had a case yet and is on the far western border, is very different in what's going on there, et cetera. But the economic impact that we both speak of, I think, is the biggest deal. And how can we have a real economic engine that can actually give us some degree of growth and allow us to continue to have those resources that we need, whatever they are, to battle this issue and others, I just think is critical. So how can we keep that going? It's great to get more money from the federal government, but eventually we have to pay for that. So I like to be judicious with those dollars as they come through, to say, where can I change? Where can I change that curve? I'm not just interested in flattening it. If I can lower it, I want to do that. I want to keep thinking, as many of us have gotten focused on a mask. That's not the only thing. What other things could have a use at prevention? What could have cures are a little further away, but how do I be smart about the actions I take in terms of distance, in terms of hand washing, sanitizing, and just considering any of those things that might, and how do we make sure that we measure them as objectively as possible? We have quickly jumped to, if the idea came from the Democrat or the Republican, I'm for it or I'm not for it. That's really not a useful approach. We have to say, hey, let's all take a huge breath. Look at this, say, how might I measure that? How might I get objective results? How might I check it again just to see, is there any value to that idea before I totally reject it? And then continue to move forward. I fear we're leaving some of our good ideas on the table, either collectively or individually. As you say, well, that's not for me. I think we have to look at under every rock we can. And if there's a 1, 2, 5% chance, I may not want to dismiss that yet. Oftentimes you've got to move away from that lower probability, but I want to see what can help. And I want to keep my mind open and hear other ideas. that I might be able to try if I have to go into a higher risk environment than the one I'm in, or if I ask someone else, I ask my teachers, or if I ask my healthcare workers to go into that environment, is there anything I can give them to give them a better chance of defense?
Okay, thank you, Representative Johnson. It sounds like you both agree that the approach that needs to be taken is comprehensive, and I think that there's a lot of room for bipartisan collaboration there. And I want to stay on this topic of COVID-19, but before we do that, I just want to take a quick pause and go to our fact checker for tonight's event, Alex Thiessen, to see if there have been any fact checks requested yet. Alex?
There have been no fact checks as of yet.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And just a reminder for those of you tuning in, please utilize the Q&A feature should you have any fact checks. And during this pause, I'd also like to go to Christina Kirk, our roving reporter for the evening, to see if there have been any questions submitted.
Hi, yes. So we have one. Recently, Kansas had a contentious primary. In some cases, there was thousands of dollars spent to vote out more moderate Republicans to be replaced with far-right candidates. How does this affect your role as a representative, knowing that money has so much power in local politics? And what encouragement do you have about overcoming perceptions of corruption in politics?
Thank you, Christina.
Ooh. There's a lot there. The amount of money that's spent, corruption, impact of the primary election. And I know that these are all related to topics that, Jack, you have for us to talk about. Money and influence are a big deal, as we saw in the primary. Where dollars were spent, it appears that they had an impact. Perhaps there was something else going on that I'm not yet aware of. Other messages that we need to hear from voters. But a meaningful shift in the primary election, when you look at ideology and a hard shift to the right in the outcome of elections on the whole, that is the result of something. Is it the money? Is it that campaigning? Is it those strategies? I think that plays a role. We did have a slightly higher turnout, maybe a meaningfully higher turnout. Maybe our fact checkers could help with that. If I can even ask for that. If there's I think we were around 30% in our turnout a lot of places, and I don't have a great deal of reference what that might have been in previous years. I think Douglas County reported a record at around 31%, but I'm not positive. If there's a higher turnout of voters, is that telling us anything? Corruption. What I would characterize what I have seen is a degree of putting my interest first. And I don't necessarily know if that is corruption, trying to subvert the system to get my way, could be, but there are many interests across the spectrum that focus on how can I get my message heard, how can I get my policy implemented and brought forth in Kansas, perhaps to my direct benefit. We always want to question what that is and whether that is also good for the state. I'd argue in many cases it's not. I don't know if it hits the level of corruption. I don't want to excuse it. I want to be objective in how I characterize that. How does it make it work as we head back? Well, there are different policies. So Representative Clayton and I have both been there since 2012 and seen some changes over time where there were policies that were enacted in 2012 through 2016 under a more conservative House and Senate. We saw how that played out for some period of time. Perhaps we didn't see it play out long enough to see it work as it was projected. We saw some change in that in response to credit ratings, in response to school funding, and working to meet some of those issues in response to funding pensions, one of the other areas that I've worked with. And there's always that balance. As we addressed all of those issues, that required a different direction than was taken by some of the policies during that time frame of 2012 to 2016. As I look at that, I then anticipate what of those policies might I see more of a direction toward as we go back. And that doesn't make them good or bad, but how does that play out over the next 5 years, over the next decade for the state? And what I'll often look for is what is our most consistent, what's our most direct path from A to B. I don't necessarily relish taking a hard swing to the right and a hard swing to the left to eventually wind up at that same point. I think that dialogue of saying, where do we need to be each step along the way is important. But most importantly, what I want to digress to is related to that question. And that is the importance of the engagement of all of us in each step of that process. Who we first decide to send to Topeka, who we first decide to send to Washington, who we decide to send to our county commissions, greatly shapes the policies we will even be able to ask for. We can do all of our best lobbying, all of our great work in those environments once we are impaneled, but we really need to be asking those questions at each step along the way. Is this the direction the state wants to go? Because it was on Tuesday night that we made perhaps a majority of the decisions that we will make in the next 2 years in terms of policy.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. Go ahead, Representative Clayton.
Thank you. I'll piggyback a little bit on some of the things that Representative Johnson said. Turnout has been higher in the primary. In Johnson County, our turnout, at least, now we still have some advanced ballots that are trickling in, so that number is going to change tomorrow, but as of close of business, I think yesterday, our turnout was about 31.7%, which is, higher than it's normally been. Now that's overall though. So I don't have it broken down based on party. I don't even have it broken down based on legislative district yet. I have one of the highest turnout districts in the state. I don't think it's the absolute highest, but it's definitely top 5. So people just love to vote up here. But I do have some concerns with some of the results that I see in the primary, because what I tend to see, and I have a unique perspective because I served 6 years as a Republican and I've served 2 years as a Democrat, and I'm seeking another term as a Democrat. So having served on both sides of the aisle, I think one of the places where I found disappointment is that you do see that people want a binary, and there isn't a binary in politics. There are tons of shades of gray. Even when I talk about the urban-rural divide, that's not even necessarily a real thing, because you think about this, Johnson County, a huge amount of people who live in Johnson County now grew up in rural Kansas and moved here for varying reasons. And so their hearts are still back home in that part of the state. And so one thing that I've found is that they want to make sure that I'm making policy that doesn't, decimate rural Kansas, because that's home to a lot of them. So again, like thinking about this, you don't really have that sort of either or. When we talk about corruption, I've been in races that have had nasty postcards that your fact checkers would easily rip to shreds. But once you can't put the honey back in the comb, right? Once it's been said and your voters see it, they're going to, many of them are going to believe it. I think, obviously if I could find a way to repeal Citizens United, I would, but I am not at that level of government, and that's not necessarily my place. My place as a representative is to make sure that when I say things, to try to say things that I know where I can cite my source. I try my best to do that, and trying to say things where you're not firing people up, especially now when we're in a nation that's facing crisis. You don't want to be poking people just to light up the pleasure centers in their brains. You want to be giving them information that they can actually use, because it's dangerous right now. It's dangerous economically and for health. And so I think the responsible thing to do in a campaign situation is to lay it out in a calm and professional manner. If there was a way that I could shut down the special interests, or at least make them disclose their donors so we knew who was behind them, then I would. But lacking that power myself and knowing that the only person whose actions I can control are my own, that's sort of where you start with. And so my advice to voters is watch the conduct of your representatives, or of those who want to be your representative, and ask them those hard questions. And remember, if they're making you feel really, really angry or really, really happy, ask yourself this: why are they appealing to your emotions and not to, things that are based on fact? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was certainly an excellent question. I'm very glad we got to have that discussion. And I know I said that I wanted to stay on that topic of COVID-19, but I think for the sake of time, and to make sure we fit in a lot of these important topics we sort of chose for tonight, I want to talk now about, I want to transition to a conversation about Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act in Kansas, a policy that Missouri voters just decided on at the ballot box earlier this week, deciding to approve it on Tuesday. And Medicaid expansion has become a contentious issue in Kansas, with numerous attempts to achieve its passage, including a recent bipartisan compromise that ended unsuccessfully. And I want to ask Representative Johnson this question first. Why should all young voters know about, what should all young voters know about Medicaid expansion in Kansas, including its legislative history and what its future might be?
Sure. So thanks again, Jack. And this has been a big issue, and probably should have been a bigger issue in the legislature, where we dealt with it directly and more swiftly. For a variety of reasons, that hasn't happened. I know that oftentimes there's an interest in where we stand on that issue, and I did vote for expansion the times it was before the legislature. I think that was twice that we may have had that opportunity, and would continue to do that. I do worry about how we pay for it at the federal level, but given that that is the law of the land, I support that Kansas would have the share of money, given that we all pay taxes federally. If 31 states are getting benefit from that, I would be inclined to join those states, both for the care it provides, for the ability to have some more dollars flowing through our healthcare system as we compete with them for healthcare providers, and all of the other things that are going on. So that's not a view that is shared, obviously, by a number of folks. So the history has been, we have passed it in the House. We have not gotten it passed in the Senate. Some of that was due to the Senate leadership choosing that route. Some of it was due to the number of votes that were there. But right now, in the primary, going back to the importance of those primary elections, we lost 6 votes in the Senate that had voted on Medicaid expansion. To go a little deeper, that was one of the key issues that was used during the election. So were we hearing something from Kansans that was different from what I thought I had heard previously? I don't know that I can be entirely sure. But it was an issue that played in that. And as we look to how that plays out when we get to the next session, we did also pick up 1 vote. So there's a net 5 difference so far. The next question is what happens in November. Will those seats then change and move to the Democrat side, where we may pick those up again? It's a fairly tall order to change that many seats, regardless of where they're changing. Not that it cannot happen, but that was a very big deal. Perhaps the biggest deal of this week on Tuesday night was that change and the impact that that has on the future of Medicaid expansion. Now, the history is checkered in a number of ways. We not only had that, we had the life issue the Catholic Church weighed in on, and others saying we must have definition on this before we can move forward on the Medicaid issue. So many different pieces that could be looked at to say, why did this not happen? In the end, it comes down to what did the legislature, what did the legislative leaders do, allow, act on, and how did that play out? Again, in the House, eventually there was a position to pass that never was addressed in the Senate. Was an intention to take it up at the beginning of this year. of this past year. So 2 years ago, there was promises made that we'll deal with this right off the bat in January. So all was good until the issue had come up related to life, saying, oh, now this is an issue, it must be addressed before we address the Medicaid issue. That then led to a stalemate, which brought us to the time that we went home, given the pandemic, and that wrapped up where we were. So regardless of where we were, where are we? Continues to stay tuned, but likely that was taken off the table by the votes that we would see from the primary.
Thank you, Representative Johnson, for that extensive point. And Representative Clayton, what is your perspective? What do all voters need to know about Medicaid expansion in Kansas, including its legislative history and its future?
Well, I think the biggest thing that voters need to know is that since Missouri passed expansion, and since I have a district that goes right up to state line, we sort of have those contiguous communities. So my community tends to blend with Kansas City by virtue of being part of the Kansas City Metro. And so I hear a lot of constituents who are kind of new on the scene saying, well, why can't we just vote on it? Well, unlike Missouri, Kansas does not have initiative and referendum. And so, very rarely do we get those things on the ballot. I think in order to get it on the ballot to put in our Constitution, we would need to have 2/3 majorities in both the House and the Senate. Since we weren't even able to get a simple majority, weren't even able to get it out of committee, as a matter of fact, in the Senate, let alone to a vote on the Senate floor, despite some procedural efforts. Not sure why the majority leader didn't just put it on the calendar, as he had the power to do that and he supported that. But I think that's one of those many mysteries that will just be left unsolved, I suppose. But so you don't have something that can go directly to the voters. I think it's really frustrating to a lot of citizens who want this, who just say, well, why can't you just do this and make it happen? So it's difficult. For instance, Representative Johnson spoke about a constitutional amendment that Kansans for Life and the Catholic Church and a Family Policy Institute all wanted. So they wanted this constitutional change, and they sort of held Medicaid expansion hostage and said, if you don't do this thing, we're not going to let you vote on this thing. And so I think it's frustrating to a lot of people at home to sort of watch this and just throw up their hands and say, why is our legislature acting like 5-year-olds? But you also have to keep in mind that the legislature is, it's a flat organization for the most part. You've got a lot of people who are, 40 equal votes in the Senate, 125 equal votes in the House, and you've got everyone coming to the table with what they want, and a lot of people will be really strong and won't budge. I myself am very obstinate on issues that are important to my constituents, and you won't see me budging very often. So I can't hardly criticize those that won't budge on their own issues if I'm the same way on mine. So as we look at this and as we move forward, I think one of the big frustrations is knowing, the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce supports Medicaid expansion. They supported it for the Missouri side. They support it for Kansas side. And so, K-State did a study, and I don't have the year that they did this, but K-State's study basically said that if we expanded Medicaid in Kansas, we would create upwards, 13,000 or more jobs. And so, especially now, job creation is important. When we think about this too, we've got the Urban Institute that said that around 40% of people lost their job-related healthcare coverage due to COVID. And, and then you've got, around 23% who I think in non-expense, well, I'm going to go ahead and just not cite that because my notes were terrible. So I don't want to say the wrong thing. But essentially, you look at this economic benefit, you look at the fact that a lot of our health insurance is tied to our jobs. You have that in a medical emergency situation and an economic emergency situation, and it makes even more sense to expand that. I think you have a lot of people reacting badly to Medicaid expansion because you see people who are campaigning against it, calling it Obamacare expansion. So, I got attacked on that fairly roundly during a primary, when I was a Republican, saying that, huge fan of Obama and that sort of thing, which was, again, designed to upset voters. And so I think you also see people using this sort of fiery terminology, like, why would we want to help able-bodied people? And that always gives me pause because, I remember when I was in graduate school and I was working 3 jobs, none of which provided health insurance. And I was working really hard and I was quite able-bodied. 2 of those jobs were waiting tables. And that did not make me a freeloading trash person that didn't deserve health insurance. In fact, a lot of these people who are in jobs where health insurance isn't provided are some of our hardest working Kansans. And yeah, I want them to have health insurance. It also makes sense to me to support it from a long game standpoint, because if someone has insurance earlier in life and they're going to their annual physicals and that sort of thing, then again, we talked earlier about preventative measures as far as the economy was concerned, right? Maybe if you mask and distance now, we can have prosperity earlier if we keep those cases down. So to me, it makes logical sense, because I think a lot of times people talk about Medicaid expansion like we need to protect our fellow man. And like, yes, that's important. We talk about it from the heart. But as a legislator, I look at this from the head and from bottom lines. It makes more sense for businesses to have healthier people coming in because that keeps the insurance pool numbers lower if everyone is healthy has been getting care. So even from that standpoint, and I think that's part of the reason why you start seeing more chambers of commerce supporting this and putting this on their platform. So I could very clearly talk about this all night, but I think the toughest part is in getting those votes in the legislature is that you're going to have a lot of legislators who are going to sort of give this pause because look at these people who supported expansion and look at what happened to them. They paid for it. They lost their elections in many ways, maybe not just because of supporting expansion, but because they didn't, kind of walk this line that they were expected to. So it does create a climate of fear and it stifles ideas. Sometimes I just, wish that those, some of those groups that get involved in politics can just go kind of sit in their corner, let us have our conversations and hash it out and, and stay out of it to a certain degree. But that is not the way that it works. We have to make sure that everyone's all in that room, even if the people that are in the room and in the elections are disrupting things.
Thank you, Representative Clayton. Yeah, those were 2 very, very excellent points. And I 2 excellent perspectives. I'm glad we were able to hear those. I think especially now that Medicaid expansion has been passed in Missouri, I think the conversation around that in Kansas is really going to gain a lot of traction. I know, especially among young voters. So certainly glad we got to fit that in. And now at this point, I would like to take another pause and go first to our fact checker, Alex Thiessen, to see if anybody in our audience has requested any fact checks. Alex?
No one has requested any fact checks from the audience. As far as the other questions concerning voter turnout, we're still working on them and verifying links. We'll get back.
Thank you, Alex. And then now I want to also, during this pause, go to Christina, again, our roving reporter, to see if anybody in the audience has asked a question. Christina?
No questions at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, with that, I want to transition to another topic that is of particular relevance to young people in America, and that's climate change and how future environmental policy will be shaped to address climate change or even prevent its catastrophic consequences. Here at American Public Square, we actually had a digital student initiative event back in April where we invited leaders from Kansas and Missouri to discuss how American systems and institutions are helping or hindering efforts to address climate change. We really only scratched the surface of a really crucially important topic here. So I think it's important that we talk about it here during this particular student program. And I want to ask Representative Johnson this question first. What should all new voters know about what Kansas elected officials are doing to respond to concerns about climate change?
So as we look at Kansas and responses on climate change, one of the major initiatives has been wind and alternative energy. That's been a meaningful investment in the state. That's a resource that we have. It worked well to develop it. If I haven't already taken all of our fact checkers' time, I don't know exactly where Kansas ranks. I hear people say we're first. I don't think we're first. I think it depends on whether you're looking at total energy produced. If you look at the percent of energy produced, you may get slightly different numbers. I remember when I was in business school, regularly there were 20 schools that claimed to be top 10. I think we're in the top 5 and most measures that are on that, which is one useful piece. I think that we can have a role as we work towards solar and other energies that are there. At the same time, for me, I want to make sure that we have a balance of all of the different sources that are there, and we make sure we have an end game of how I pay for each of those things along the way. I can't have an outsized contribution to a technology that may or may not work. I have to take those steps together and make sure that that's all possible. In that, when I make those investments, that footprint isn't free. When I look at industry and their contribution, it is, the production of iron and other things is a big part of that. Well, that is part of what I'm investing in the wind energy. And how do I really get to the zero part of that? The one thing that I think is useful, I think on a couple of key points, there is agreement. I think people agree that temperatures have been increasing. And I think people agree that CO2 is increasing. I think it's fairly hard to refute those things. One thing that I would continue to keep an open mind on is exactly what impact do I attribute to each of those, and how does that play forward? I am not as certain and convinced of that as I carry that out, knowing that the increase in temperature is a logarithmic relationship. As you increase the CO2 parts per million, how does that increase continue to impact? How does the fact that H2O will be our largest greenhouse gas, certainly not our only, how does that impact? How do I look at, so one of the things I worry about from where I am are drought impacts. And I don't know how that all plays out. I know a lack of greenhouse gases can also result in that. As CO2 comes down too low, below 150 parts per million roughly, you start to have a dampening effect on plant growth. So I know none of us are looking at going there, but what is that balance that can be sustained, and how does all of that fit together? And how do I look long-term at what historical temperature patterns and causes have been there and try to measure all of those, so that I want to make sure that if I am moving the stone, that I know the impact of moving that before I put outsized resources to that particular effort. So I'm not an expert on climate change. I absolutely want to continue asking the questions. I want to make certain that we leave the world overall better than we found it. I'm committed to that on all of the fronts that are there, and look forward to continuing to ask those questions to make sure that each step we take has a positive net result.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. Representative Clayton, in your view, what should all voters know about what Kansas elected officials are doing to respond to concerns surrounding climate change?
Well, I'm sure you saw my face when Representative Johnson mentioned wind, because I mean, that's the first thing that I think about when I think about the good things and the ways that we are able to, and by we, I mean Kansas legislators from all over the state, different parties are able to come together on things. Because when we were looking at, the renewable portfolio standards, we had, and when I say we, I mean, legislators from Johnson County who, while there really isn't a single windmill unless you count the decorative garden ones, here in my district, we're very cognizant of the fact that we like the idea of clean energy. We like that idea. Aside from just liking the idea and wanting to see a better state, people in the portions of Kansas that actually have the wind farms, they don't just like it. This is helpful to their economy. And so often when we're able to actually accomplish things in the legislature, you might see people with whom you feel like you disagree on things, but there are always things where you can find allies on. And wind was absolutely one of them. I think also when we look at the environment, some of the first environmentalists were farmers, because obviously it makes sense to them to take care of the land, to make sure that, it's conducive to crops growing, to all sorts of things. And so they don't want to see things destroyed or burned down. And Stephen, if I'm I'm mansplaining farming to you, just let me know, because but this at least is my perception of the way that a lot of farmers look at the earth and want to take care of it, because, you know, they're quite literally living off of it and benefiting from it. For a while, we had a committee called Water and the Environment, and you know, I didn't sit on it. I can't remember if Stephen did or not, but again, that's incredibly important to us too, the preservation of the Ogallala Aquifer. And we have a lot of fights, but, you know, between us and Nebraska and everyone, you know, for who can draw from that, how long it will last. But water is of great import, and funding our water plan for the state is something that's really going to, you know, end up being beneficial to us. So these are some of the things that you start seeing us look at, but, you know, understanding that even if it doesn't look like people are coming at it for the best reasons, in other words, it makes financial sense for our agrarian economy to have a good preserved environment, but who really cares why it's being preserved as long as it is being preserved? And so I think that's where you start seeing a lot of those people coming together. And, you know, I do see positive things. I have a positive outlook on that. I've seen a lot of good things happening in our state in that area.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I kind of want to follow up on that just really, really briefly. And ask both of you, feel free to jump in, whoever wants to take it first. But from your perspective, why do you think that climate change has become a partisan issue in some sense?
So I can't explain that on a number of issues, but clearly that we have some predilection towards those. Perhaps Republicans were sensitive to being directed to invest more in some of those technologies that we weren't as sure about, and those happen to be aligned at the moment. And that could have wound up on opposite sides of the party line if that's the case. But it's not, and measuring it is not, and making sure that that works, just as the pandemic should not be a partisan. And each of these, then the response I can always control is mine, right? Even like one of the things I loved when I first saw American Public Square was the line from Arthur Brooks, love his book, have love your enemies, literally right here. It stays there because I don't get it finished read, but I really appreciated it. But he talks about the fact that where I can change is me. And from there, where do I go next? Well, a great place can be, what could my university do that is beneficial to the university, beneficial to the campus, and maybe be a model to say, why don't other universities do this? Why don't other communities do this? So where we have that creativity, don't underestimate the fact that we can do more with that and demonstrate that it's not a partisan issue, then we're in great shape. If I come back and I say, those Republicans just don't get it, then it will stay where it is in that and say, oh, but you got to understand that this is the case, et cetera. And here's how I'm measuring it. While those, I may be a little more inclined to believe that, it doesn't always carry a long ways in how I might change someone's heart on the issue. And that's where eventually we have to get, is to say, okay, are you really intending to have this impact? And can we agree on what that is? And try to break that down on a number of fronts. But I don't know how we've gotten here.
Representative Clayton?
Well, let's see. I mean, I think, yes, a lot of times you do see climate change as a partisan issue, but I also think that sometimes the loudest voices are not necessarily the most representative of the way that things go. And I also think, too, that it would be helpful if, if those of us who do believe in climate change and want to prevent it, perhaps spoke of it in a more palatable way to our colleagues. So for instance, to me, okay, you think about the book, The Lorax, right? Okay, so remember how he clear cut the forests and then he moved away because he wasn't making any more money? Well, okay, so being pro-environment and protecting the environment, that's long game that offers also financial and economic sense as well. And so I think if you put it in those terms, because, one thing, and again, I know I probably don't sound like a very good Democrat right now at all, but I mean, money is important to people. Their livelihood is important to them. And so I think if we pose this, that, hey, preservation of the climate and of the way that things are does tend to, allow for a more stable environment in which we can all prosper. That's messaging that frankly is logical, makes sense, and sets taking care of the environment up in positive financial ways. And I think that's going to make it a lot more palatable and make a lot more people comfortable with looking at these preventative measures.
Okay, thank you. And before we move on to sort of the conclusion of our panel here, I want to check with Alex, our fact checker, one more time to see if he was able to decide on that fact check that was requested earlier. Alex?
So I couldn't verify specifically the exact percentage because the voter turnouts were unofficial at this point, but there are some map resources that we can provide in the comments of Facebook or what have you to where it can be as corroborated as possible. And as with the Kansas Energy, the total Kansas ranks roughly 24th in total energy produced and 27th in net electricity generation, which is from the EIA.
Thank you, Alex.
So, and if I can add on that briefly, Jack, I think that relates to total production. I think as we look to, I don't know if that would be only wind. I think that's total production. And then what percent of our total production is wind? I think we're higher on those two measures. Perhaps not, but I think that we rank pretty well there. But not on total energy. That would be accurate.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And I'm really happy. Concluding with climate change, obviously, I think is a tremendous way to conclude this program. Getting to cover all the topics that we did today. Just thank you so much for coming on and doing that. And as you may know, it is an American Public Square tradition to allow each panelist a final comment. And we do this in the form of a brief response to each of two questions: so what and now what? And Representative Clayton, I want to begin with you. So what and now what?
All right. So a lot of this is, so what? Why would anyone care what two politicians from Kansas even have to say, right? A lot of times there, rightfully so, people feel apathy because there is this huge division between the way that people resolve problems in everyday life and all of these procedural frustrations that you see sort of from us. Why can't we just vote on expanding Medicaid, for instance? So I think part of the so what is, if you are, and I hate this cliche, but it's really, really accurate. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I think especially for people in the 18 to 24 or even in the 18 to 45, you don't often have a lot of representation in that age group in most legislatures. A lot of it is that because, unlike Congress, we make almost no money doing this. So, this is what we call a citizen legislature. That's why, Stephen and I both do other things aside from legislate. And so that makes it more difficult for younger people who are in college and have student loan debt and so on and so forth to really become a part and to be able to participate. So the reason why engagement is important is that, A, run for office yourself. Yes, you can do it. If you're watching this, you are engaged enough and you're definitely smart enough. We don't have education requirements. All you have to do is just know how to talk to people in your district and win that election. And so, but if you're not able to do that, I think engagement and staying on your legislators' radar, because, I will speak for Representative Johnson. I know he listens to his constituents. I listen to mine. And if you're talking to us and making your voice heard, if your legislator is worth their salt, which we both are, we are listening to you. We are going to the State House and getting it done on your behalf. So that's why you need to care, right? As far as now what is concerned, we are coming up, neither Representative Johnson nor I are strangers to legislative difficulty. We have both dealt with major budget deficits. We've dealt with major conflict. And, so we're no strangers to that. We're coming up on conflict that instead of it being politically based, now this is based on something that we can't really control, which is, COVID-19 and the economic and health implications that it has. And so watching the way that we as members of government respond to this crisis. And so I think, that's our big now what? How do we deal with this outside crisis? I've always had this theory that government should function like air conditioning on a 90-degree day. Like, you shouldn't ever know that it's there. It should be silent. You should be comfortable. It should be working. But when it breaks, like, there is no mistaking. So I think that, the now what is that even in the midst of crisis, government should continue to function like that air conditioner, working without you even really knowing that we're there. It's boring, but, honestly, if you want a good functional government, you don't want it to be exciting. You don't want it to be based in emotion. You want it to be based in logic and facts and good policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Clayton, for those closing remarks. Representative Johnson, what about you? So what and now what?
So I would say similar. And Jack, how many minutes do I have?
You're all right. Go ahead and
Okay.
take as much time as you need.
Sounds good. No worry. But just first, thanks to everyone. And thanks for being here. That is a so what. This is the so what we talked about, the importance of being engaged. Just participating in the elections is a big deal. It was a big deal this last week, and it'll be a big deal when we get to November, and it'll be a big deal again at the next election. So getting informed on our candidates, helping make those decisions, getting engaged in those campaigns, that's huge for what happens at the legislative level. And I can't stress it enough to get involved. If you care to get more involved in this, there's an intern program with the legislature also. You can contact either Stephanie and I, or we'd be thrilled to engage folks with that. We've looked for getting folks involved specifically with civil discourse and civic engagement, as well as the policy issues that we have. So that's at this level, but even more than that, it's at my level again. Every can you pick up and put in the trash can, although this is maybe not the time to touch anything that we aren't familiar with, but any of those changes that we can make day to day, a big deal. How do I just make the world better today? And answering that question in any small way. Sometimes it may only be a smile, but do that and keep doing that. And as you change that, as you change the university, some of the best service that I've done in impacting lives for me, and there's not a right for anyone, but just through our little tiny local church can impact the community through the 4-H groups and how that works, through K-State Extension and the Master Facilitator Program, through Kansas Leadership Center. All of those entities make real long-term differences. And we get to do it together after I decide to engage that way. So just a huge thank you for engaging. On the government thing, I'll underscore what Stephanie said. Jim Edgar was a governor in Illinois in the late 1990s, and one of his quotes was, "Good government is boring." By the way, he was the last governor of Illinois not to be in jail until the most recent one as well. So I think there is some truth to that statement. A lot of times it is just keeping the trains on the tracks. I don't know. 80% of the time, Republicans and Democrats and everyone votes together on the bills. It's a pretty high percent. But the big deals are at the margin, the things we talked about today. How do you feel about that? And how do you see making a difference? And how do I learn from you? And we continue to learn from each other to get that best policy out there. So thanks for the chance to engage.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent way to conclude our program tonight. And with that, our conversation and our time together here this evening will come to a close. Thank you all. And thank you to our wonderful panelists, Representative Stephen Johnson and Representative Stephanie Clayton, for taking the time to be with us tonight. I'm now going to turn it over to Allison for a few closing remarks.
Thanks, Jack. And thank you so much, Representatives Stephen and Stephanie Clayton. Thank you so much for this excellent and extremely informative discussion. We look forward to engaging with each of you in the future. I'd also like to thank our supporters who tuned in tonight. If you enjoyed this program, I hope you'll also consider joining us on the evening of August 11th for the third and final part of our summer mental health series, From Resistance to Resilience, where we have spent the summer exploring the root causes of mental illness in our community and how we can find ways to meaningfully address them. For part 3, we will host panelists as they discuss school in the time of COVID-19. Please be sure to also check out our At the Square channel on Spotify, Apple, and SoundCloud, which includes an ongoing podcast series that I help produce called Both Sides, featuring APS founder Ambassador Alan Katz on the left and co-chair to APS's advisory board, Mike McShane, on the right. Both Sides' 20th episode will be released tomorrow and features a well-rounded conversation, much like this one tonight, about the results of recent primaries in Missouri and Kansas and looking ahead to the November ballot. As many of you may know, APS relies on the support of its members to maintain its programming. We hope that those of you who are not yet members will take the opportunity tonight to officially join us. You can find membership information on our website at www.americanpublicsquare.org/membership. Additionally, after the event ends, you will receive an email with a link to a short post-event survey. We would greatly appreciate it if you spent just a few moments to complete the survey. These surveys help improve our events and let us know what kinds of programs our supporters want to see from us. Once again, we here at American Public Square at Jewell and our student initiative, thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you have a great evening and a safe and healthy rest of your summer. Hope to see you again soon.